A woman treats her husband like trash, cheats on him, divorces him, and regrets it 6 months later.
If I could give anyone advice about divorce, it would be this: don't get divorced over trivial matters. If your spouse is abusive or threatens you or your children, then, of course, leave as soon as you can. But in my case, there was no abuse. We were together for 8 years, and most of that time was good. We have 4 children. About 5 years in, I got a promotion at work. I started feeling like my husband was holding me back, or at the very least, keeping me from achieving greater success and a better life. We never had much money, but after my promotion, I started earning more than he did. I began working longer hours while his work hours were cut back. He started spending more time at home. I began to resent him for being home and taking care of the kids while I was working. Most evenings when I got home, the kids were either getting ready for bed or already asleep. After a few months, it became clear that things at home weren't going very well without me. Some evenings, I'd come home to find the dishes unwashed, the kids unfed, or something else left undone. I'd get angry at him for it. Even though he said he'd try harder, it didn't ease my frustration. Over the next couple of years, things only got worse. My work hours stayed long, and his were inconsistent, sometimes full-time, sometimes part-time. Because of my job, he couldn't work full-time, but we still needed the money. When he said he could take on extra hours, I'd express dissatisfaction. The less he worked, the more I complained about him not bringing in enough money. When he pointed out the contradictions, I'd tell him to figure it out. I knew it hurt him, so I said it often. I started hating him and pulling away. I knew I was hurting him, but I didn't care. If he didn't want to be hurt, he would try to make me happy. That was the same justification I used when I began talking to another man at work. At first, I thought he was just a friend, but workplace conversations turned into texting at home, then photos, videos, and attempts to spend time alone together. I knew it was wrong, but it made me feel alive in a way I hadn't with my husband for years. The worst was one evening when I came home to find my husband had cleaned the entire house, cooked dinner for the whole family, and picked a movie for us to watch. A couple of years earlier, this would have melted my heart, but that evening I couldn't even look at him. I pretended to be sick and spent the rest of the night in bed. He cared for me, took my temperature, cooked something else, and brought it to me in bed. It made me feel horrible, and then it made me angry. By the end of the night, I was back to texting the other man. Over the next month or 2 after that evening, it didn't matter what he did. He was wrong just for breathing. He became deeply upset by the way I treated him, but I didn't care. I was just waiting, pushing him toward a breaking point because I knew it would happen eventually. After most of our arguments, he would apologize for whatever he did wrong, even if there wasn't really anything. I never apologized. Instead, I usually found a way to make him feel even worse. I was convinced I was right, simply because he was wrong, and that was all that mattered to me. I even pretended not to care when he found out about my relationship with the guy from work. The truth is, it tore me apart inside to see him barely holding back tears. But I wasn't about to show him that. He was at his most vulnerable, and that's when I decided to tell him I wanted a divorce. I could almost hear his heart breaking. He pleaded, fought with himself, and said over and over that we could work things out together. I wasn't interested in fixing our marriage. However, I did end things with the guy from work because I knew I could always go back to him if I wanted. I saw that my husband was trying, and sometimes I would let him know that I noticed. But for the most part, I continued being a terrible person, nitpicking him over every little thing I could think of. I'm not sure there was anything he could have done to make me happy, except maybe finding a job that paid enough so I wouldn't have to work at all. He said he was looking for one, but there's a big difference between looking and finding. Around this time, I started browsing the internet, reading similar stories and sharing my own. The more I did, the more validation I got that I was right. I had the entire internet telling me what a terrible husband he was. I began saying awful things to him, and even openly ignoring him. I was so sure I was right that I contacted a lawyer and within a couple of weeks filed for divorce. Finally, it was over. The process went relatively smoothly. My husband didn't ask for much, other than not to divorce and to try and work things out. I didn't care. He was broken, but I was free. I could do whatever I wanted without guilt or answering to anyone. It was an incredible feeling of freedom, but it didn't last. Within the first month of his moving out, I missed trash day 3 times. There were rarely clean dishes in the kitchen, and the laundry sat in piles so long that I started sniffing clothes before putting them on. The kids seemed miserable. My oldest daughter saw texts from my boyfriend and knew her dad had wanted to work things out. She stopped talking to me, except to ask to go to her dad's house. The other kids also started asking to live with him. I tried to make them happy, but it always ended with buying toys that only brought them joy for minutes. I was struggling at work too. I couldn't put in all the extra hours that were expected of me. Eventually, I started calling my ex-husband to watch the kids. He always came when he could and often asked if I needed anything. When I returned home, I'd find clean dishes, folded laundry, and sometimes even dinner. He barely spoke to me, only saying to call if I needed something, and then he'd leave. He looked so sad that I couldn't look at him without feeling guilt. Finally, some friends convinced me to go on a date. But during dinner, I was overwhelmed with guilt so intense that I couldn't even make it to the movie. A week later, after hundreds of tears, I found myself in a therapist's office. I told her everything, starting with my promotion at work. She didn't agree with the arguments for divorce I had gotten from the internet. The more I tried to prove I was right, the more I realized how wrong I had been. It was truly heartbreaking. After spending $2,000 on therapy, I finally understood the magnitude of my mistakes. I had done and said so many awful things that even I wouldn't want to be around me. But he did. Recently, as he was leaving, I asked if he'd ever consider coming back. He said he didn't know if he could ever trust me again. The pain had been too long and too deep. He admitted that he thought I'd realize how much he loved me and stop before signing the divorce papers, but I didn't. That was what hurt him the most. I destroyed our marriage, took a wonderful father away from our kids, and lost a man who, looking back, was a great husband. Now I spend all my free time at home or in therapy, thinking about how things could have been different. Please, think twice before destroying your marriage. Give it a chance.
What do you think about this situation? Do you believe the protagonist is at fault or not? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Now here's my take on this story. Initially, when I read it, I felt there wasn't much to add. It's clear. The wife made terrible choices, abandoned a great husband, and now both she and the kids are suffering. What more is there to say? But after discussing this story with my wife, she brought up some intriguing points that made me rethink my stance. And honestly, I agree with her. What were her thoughts? Let me explain. At first glance, the wife wasn't entirely wrong. Their marriage wasn't working for her. She felt liberated with other men. If her marriage wasn't fulfilling, then what's so bad about seeking a divorce? The real issue lies elsewhere. Her regret seems less about the emotional loss and more about the practical problems. What is she truly upset about? Sure, her kids are unhappy and distant, which is understandable. They're bound to be upset in such a situation. But fundamentally, her regrets seem tied to things like dirty dishes, unwashed laundry, and other domestic responsibilities. If those issues didn't exist, would she still feel guilty? Would her perspective have changed? Another point that struck me was how the psychologist handled things. When you go to therapy, you're looking for support and guidance. Yet the psychologist in this case seemed to tell her, "You're wrong on every level." How does that help? Is she just supposed to suffer in guilt? So what do you think? Do you agree with me or do you have a different perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and here's to happy relationships and brighter days ahead.